to the OFS Chats podcast. It's your host, PanDamnMick today. Today we're having a very amazing conversation. One and only Rufaro Samanga. She'll introduce herself shortly. But like we've always done each week, we always try to tackle different topics, have different guests on and speak about different dynamics that relate to us as young Black people, especially in the professional world, things that impact us. And this week, I think I've been trying to have this conversation for the longest time, and today is better no late than never. We're going to be talking about the aspects of the vaccine, but I think more so to separate just from speaking about the vaccine, we're going to be speaking about Rufaro, who she is, what she does, and get a kind of one-on-one understanding of what she is as a person, what she believes in, her views on life, and you get to know a bit more. So just to get the ball rolling, let me introduce Rufaro. Rufaro, welcome to the Chats podcast.
Hi. I actually wanted to kind of chuckle when you're like the one and only Rufaro Samanga, because Rufaro is such a common name in Zim.
Oh, okay.
People here are always like, oh my goodness, it's such an exotic name. And I'm like, if you go to Zim, everybody and their friend is called Rufaro. So I was just like, am I the one and only? But I get what you're saying.
Okay, so
Thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. What exactly does your name actually mean, though?
So Rufaro is... not that deep. Rufaro just means joy or happiness in Shona. I think I live up to my name quite well. So, yeah.
Okay. So in terms of, just because you just mentioned you from Zim, obviously your name comes from that. Just give us context of your background exactly. Where did you grow up? How was your upbringing per se?
Yeah, so I was born in South Africa, but my parents, my family are from Zim. So I always say, I'm Zimbabwean South African. It's quite a contentious thing sometimes, this identity thing. You'll have people say, yeah, but you were born in South Africa, so you can't be Zimbabwean. Then I'll go home to Zim and they'll say, yeah, but you were also born in, South Africa, so you can't be Zimbabwean. But, I always say that I'm not just the one without the other. I am both. So I always say I'm Zimbabwean South African, but born here, raised here, went to school here. But Zim was always that place when, school holidays, a funeral happens, a wedding is going to happen, whatever the case may be, we were back home. So I was, born and raised here, but very much a Zimbo at heart as well.
Okay. And in terms of family, are you like the firstborn, lastborn?
Yeah, I'm the firstborn of three, and I have two younger siblings, both boys. So I am the eldest.
Sheesh, those responsibilities.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming from an African household context, that means, growing up, you had to kind of be the one who had to kind of cheer on and be the face of, the children taking on the responsibilities. Did you actually get to enjoy your childhood in terms of, there's a stereotype that, being a firstborn, you kind of have to go through the mud first, then everyone else gets it easy.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Honestly, I think, I've seen it in other families, but I think because, I grew up in such a chilled Black family, maybe if I'd grown up in Zim, things would have been different. But, when we grew up here, like my mom and dad, pretty chilled people. Yes, I never had, this firstborn pressure to like, oh my gosh, I need to do this. And I think I just, had a very much self-inflicted pressure of I need to do well at school because my dad was very academic oriented. But, I had a childhood, I had a fun childhood. I spent very little of it thinking, am I, being a role model to my younger siblings? None of that. I think that only really came for me much later on in life when my dad passed and, I was now in varsity and, the boys were going through, the typical teenage years and being a handful for my mom. That's when I was like, I wonder how much of what I do in my personal life and also professionally, kind of influences them in terms of, what they think for their own lives. But, when I was growing up, I was just a kid doing my own thing.
Okay. No, I think I would probably say I have the opposite effect. I'm the lastborn. So
really?
Yeah. So
you're the baby.
Yeah, I'm the baby. Although my dynamic's even more worse because my oldest brother is probably turning 50. And you see like the age gap between my siblings is quite big. So it almost felt like I was the only child in some dynamics. So that was just
Wow. How many are you at home?
We're probably like 4. Yeah, we're 4, in fact. Yeah, 4. Yeah.
Wow, 50 is, so how old are you?
29.
If I may ask.
29 next year.
That's not bad. That's not bad.
Yeah, well, it has its perks. Yeah, but I think the question I was reason I'm asking you about just your background is I should understand exactly how you brought up, as to see exactly how it contributes to who you are overall. And I assume obviously there's some aspects of how you grew up led to who you are today. Also know you did some journalism as well. You also you did some activism work as well in terms of even your journalism, things you write about. Especially in terms of issues related to women, also speak to broader issues related to young people. So I think I was just trying to understand, is there a link between that? Is that contributed towards your upbringing, or in your view, just something that you realize as an adult?
I think the nerdy part of me, which is, so this, people always say to me, what exactly do you do? Because you'll be tweeting about articles you wrote, and then you're also a scientist. And I always say I have a very multi-dimensional career. We often talk about having to choose between, did you want to be this artsy kind of, language oriented person, or did you want to go into the sciences? And for me, I wanted to do both, right? But I think at the time when I was in grade 12 and thinking of, hey, what am I going to study at university? I was really pulled towards the sciences. And I think also just things like language and journalism, depending on which school you go to, don't always necessarily get great PR. So I always say, when I was young, I didn't know that I could, one, be a writer, but also, make money from writing, right? You're always told, if you become a writer, you're going to be poor, you're not going to make money. And for me, that's been the complete opposite. I've made my first money from writing. So I think, going towards the sciences rather was more because that's what had the best PR when I was in high school. My dad, much as he was, very invested in, my academics, he was quite, despite being a very typical Shona man in some senses, he was very, liberal in terms of go off and, study whatever you want to study, like just, as long as you study something. But he was very supportive of, me wanting to become a scientist. And my undergrad was in molecular biology. And, he used to call me randomly and say, hey, what are you studying again? And I had to be like, I'm doing molecular and cell biology. So he was, super stoked that was the route that, I was taking. But he was also very supportive of, my aspirations of becoming a writer, right? So I think part of my upbringing, my dad was a very central figure in my life. But I do think that the decision to study the sciences really came from me. I think I was very interested in, very inquisitive and curious. And I think science really gave me an outlet because you're asking questions, you're designing experiments and trying to best answer those questions. One of my favorite shows when I was growing up was Medical Detectives. And for the longest time, I wanted to be a toxicologist because it seemed like the toxicologist was the one who always solved, the case. But when I got to varsity, and I started understanding more about the biological sciences, the differences between, biology and chemistry and physics, I found out I actually hated chemistry. Like I hated chemistry. And toxicology was like 4 different types of chemistry, like organic chem, inorganic chem, all of it. And I was like, nah. So what I had thought toxicology was, in reality, was not what I had hoped it would be, right? So then I kind of, started thinking, okay, what else interests me? And I was always very interested in infectious diseases, right? Things like epidemics and outbreaks and pandemics, and the impact it has on an individual level, but also on a population level. And so through molecular and cell biology, I sort of went through that route. I went into microbiology, and then eventually I ended up in epidemiology. So I suppose, that's how my dad kind of played a role just in, some of the decisions that I made. But I think, for the most part, I was quite free to decide what it is that I wanted to study, what it is that I wanted to become. And also I had the room to decide, hey, I wanted to become this when I started varsity, but not really feeling it anymore, and also just have the ability to pivot as well.
Okay, that's interesting. In fact, there's a blend between, typically when someone goes the scientific route, it's very rare that you have someone also sees a creative side as well, writing as well. So I think it's also cool to see someone having a blend. I mean, I work in the finance side, but I always had a creative side, and I'm not podcasty as a person. I'm not the outgoing person. I guess always tackling into new spaces is always cool. But now I think maybe I'd like to understand more so to the actual professional side. You said you then ended up doing, I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it epidemiologist?
Everyone gets tripped up by that word. Don't worry. It's epidemiology.
Okay, perfect. Now, in terms of actually, what exactly is it? Because, when the pandemic started, we saw people on the news and you see this big title, virologist, epidemiologist. What exactly is it?
So epidemiology is a branch of medicine, in scientific speak, and by definition, it's looking or rather studying patterns or distributions of disease amongst the population. So the key differentiator for epidemiology is, when you look at someone like a doctor or a nurse, any of those, kind of clinician type public health professionals, they deal with people or patients on an individual basis and they treat them on an individual basis. But epidemiologists are looking at things on a population level, right? So I'm looking at not so much, what is the micro effect of a vaccine on an individual person, but I'm looking at what is the population level effect of vaccines. Do they help? Do they not help? Right? So it's not always looking at disease. Sometimes it's a lot more positive outcomes. I always say epidemiologists, fundamentally, we deal with outcomes and exposures. So I always say classic epidemiology is doctors way back when started, observing that, hey, a lot of the patients that are coming in that I'm seeing, they're developing lung cancer. And one thing that I'm observing across all of them is a lot of them are actually smokers, right? That was, back when, tobacco was used for everything and no one knew about, the effects of tobacco. And then epidemiologists are the guys that said, hey, let's do a study. Does smoking increase your chances of developing lung cancer? So, the exposure was smoking and the outcome was lung cancer. And that's basically what we do, as epidemiologists. We look at various exposures and then we see, what possible health outcomes, result because of that. But it can also be positive things, not necessarily always disease and negative outcomes. It can be, hey, if you exercise 3 times a week, does your risk of a cardiovascular adverse event decrease, right? So that's basically what we do. We look at if you're exposed to something, what is the likelihood that you're going to develop a specific outcome?
Okay, and then what is a virologist? Is that something related to viruses or?
Yes, absolutely. So a virologist, more on the microbiology end of things. So in microbiology, you've got, in terms of microorganisms, you've got bacteria, you've got viruses, you've got fungi. And so virologist is really someone who is studying or well-versed or knowledgeable and expert in the study of viruses and how they work, and also how they affect human beings or, other species around them.
Okay. But now in terms of epidemiology, in terms of how the career path into getting into it, because I know you mentioned that you took the route of taking microbiology and all that. Is that the standard way? Because I know you did your master's in it. Was there particular career choices of career degrees you have to do until you end up in that particular career? Or is there a particular variation you can just choose whatever science and then get there?
So it depends, in South Africa, epidemiology is largely offered at the postgraduate level. So you can't do an undergrad in epidemiology, right? In other countries, you can, do the undergrad, you can go on into postgrad right up to PhD or postdoc. But here, I think there's one university, could be UP, I'm not sure, that offers it at an honors level, but, Stellenbosch and UCT and Wits, all of those universities offer epidemiology at a master's level. And because of that, then, the path to becoming an epidemiologist is quite open. So, in my class, I was someone who had come from the lab-based, microbiology scene, but, I had colleagues who were actual clinicians, they were doctors, I had people who were nurses, who were psychologists. So you didn't necessarily have to study something specific in your undergrad or even in your honors to do the epidemiology. So I think, that's quite advantageous, if you decide, hey, maybe chemistry isn't for me or physics isn't for me, and I'm, trying to go into something a little more public health related, that's quite open for a lot of people, because I get a lot of questions on, how do I become an epidemiologist? I always say, your path is quite open in a number of ways. But for me, I'd started off in molecular biology, and then I'd done my honors in microbiology. And I had, said to my supervisor, I'm not pretty sure that I want to do a master's in microbiology. I found being in the lab a little tedious. It's quite repetitive, because you have to make sure that, whatever experiment that you do, you have to run it in triplicate. So it's basically a whole lot of, repeating experiments. Yeah. If it doesn't work, you run more experiments. If it works, you run more experiments. And I wanted a science that was a little more people oriented. I tend to feel like being in the lab, you do all these experiments in isolation, you publish a paper, and that's pretty much where it ends. But I wanted a science where I could see the impact that science was having on people, and the end point wasn't just to publish an academic paper. Yeah. And so I actually took a gap year after my honors in 2017, and I literally spent the whole year writing. That's how I made money and justified being at home to my mom. And I was just trying to figure out, what is it that I want to do? And I knew that I wanted a combination of a study of disease, because that's what I was always interested in when I started in undergrad. But I also was very interested, and still am, in statistics, right? But at the time, I just didn't know what program could combine those two things successfully. So did a lot of, research, was, looking at what, fields can combine these two things. And then I happened, across epidemiology, and WITS at the time, the program there is still quite new compared to the other existing programs. But, when I read up about it, I was like, yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to do. And I think that was sort of like in July or August. I spent a couple of months just not knowing what I wanted to do. But after I was like, what, I want to do epidemiology. That's when the ball started rolling. I applied to WITS, applied for a scholarship. And the next year I enrolled for the master's program, and I started my master's in epidemiology.
Dope. Now, I just want to understand, what exactly does your day-to-day look like? Because, obviously you've spoken about research, statistics. Obviously now you're not necessarily centered in the lab, but what does your day-to-day look like? Like, what's a regular Monday morning looking like for you? For like a Monday?
So, when you're an epidemiologist, it's, the kind of work that you do on a day-to-day is really dependent on what organization you're working for, which sector you're working in. Is it public health? Are you in the private sector? So it varies. I have a friend who's working for the World Health Organization in the Free State. So she's very much a field epidemiologist. They're collecting data on COVID. A lot of the stats that you see compiled on COVID, that's the work that team is doing there. But for me, my current role is what is known as a digital epidemiologist, and that's quite an emerging field. I didn't even know it existed until I got the job, to be quite honest. But I work in the private sector for a data science company called Palindrome Data. So they use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and predictive analytics on public health projects, and they're specifically interested in the HIV space. So my role as a digital epidemiologist is, I consult, from a traditional epidemiology lens, and I try to bridge the two worlds. Machine learning and predictive analytics is still a very new field, but it also needs the credibility of a long-established field like epidemiology in terms of experimental design, the soundness of the science, and also just being able to kind of bridge the two worlds, so that my day-to-day really is trying to explain to clients like the Aurum Institute or Johnson & Johnson or Jepaigo, why are we using a machine learning model in this context, and how does that link up to what epidemiology looks like in a traditional sense? So I kind of feel like my role is the middleman. I'm trying to kind of pull these two worlds together. It's quite fun. The work is never the same. It's always different challenges. So on a day-to-day, I bounce between, being a part of a call with, a group of data scientists and saying, okay, guys, the methodology that you guys are using to run this experiment is great. Or I'm saying, nah, we can't do this. It doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective. Or I'm saying, okay, in data science, you guys would use these terms to describe, whether a model is performing well or not. But epidemiologists and people in public health aren't going to understand it. So let's rather use these terms because they're analogous or they're synonymous. I spend a lot of time writing project reports. This is what we did. These are the results we got. I do a lot of client management as well, and a lot of stakeholder engagement as well. So on a day-to-day, my day is really the same, but those are just some of the things that you'll find me doing in a single week. Yeah.
Okay. Now that sounds interesting. It's not the typical telephone, PC type sitting emails all day. So that's interesting. Yeah. Now, I think maybe let's touch something some people want us to speak about, and that's the vaccine. And when I was thinking about how I'm going to ask you these questions about the vaccine, typically you get asked, what's the problem with the vaccine? Does it work? Some people are hesitant, blah, blah, blah. But I wanted to also maybe speak upon, because you did write an amazing article on Medium, as how I first came across your name. And I was like, wow, it's quite interesting, exactly, getting a very detailed explanation about the issues around hesitance in the space of the vaccine, especially in the pandemic that we're in right now. And my first thought was, where exactly does this, because typically it's not just the COVID-19, but this tends to be this hesitance when it comes to medicine, issues around treatment, especially in the Black community. Maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it's a global thing. But I'm just trying to understand exactly, is there something unique about our history that relates to medication, treatment, vaccines? But what exactly is your interpretation of that? Is that the case whereby we have a historical context when it comes to medicine? Yeah. What is your view on that?
Sure. So, and I think in that Medium article that I wrote, I was thinking, it would be remiss of me, to speak about vaccines and be like, vaccines are great and we should trust them, and anyone who doesn't is silly, because, that would be very dismissive of, the kind of the history that Black people, as well as people of color in other countries, have had with the scientific community, right? And, in the same way that, we're still navigating racism and the domination of certain, most spaces by white men, that was the same thing with science. So, decades back, centuries back, science was predominantly, white men, and they pretty much could do whatever they wanted to do, right? They did very many unethical things that they regarded as science, things that, in present day, we would absolutely never ever condone, and it would never be allowed to be conducted by any sound ethics committee. But the distrust of the medical and the scientific community is one that is valid, especially amongst Black people and people of color, because there have been many incidents beforehand where unethical experiments have been run. There's the famous Tuskegee trial, which happened amongst, African-American men in the United States. And there've been so many other, experiments that we know of and may never know of, right, that have happened with, specifically targeting communities of color. So that is where that distrust comes from, right? But also, it's also understanding that not everyone knows that was, the case back then. So when I speak to someone who is, maybe vaccine hesitant or not particularly trusting of the medical or scientific community, sometimes it's not even because they know of the history, right, that the Black community has had with, scientists and clinicians back then. Yeah. Sometimes it's because of, certain cultural things, certain, like social political context. So it's never just one thing that is informing this distrust. It's a combination of things, but when we want to talk history, those are some legitimate things that happened back then, that people read about might actually make them feel like, wow, actually scientists and medical professionals really didn't have the best interests when it came to the lives and the well-being of Black people and people of color. But also there've been, things that have happened. For example, I always forget his name. I don't know if it's Andrew Wakefield or Lakefield, but anyways, it was a British doctor, infamous. If you type in MMR vaccine, autism, his name will probably pop up. And, this is a British doctor. And he infamously did the study where he then linked the MMR vaccine, which is the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine that you get shortly after you're born. And he linked that to autism in children, right? And that caused such a panic in the UK. And this was decades back. I think it was like 4 decades back, if I'm not mistaken. And it was published in the Lancet, one of the most prestigious journals. And, it was eventually retracted because it was found out that, one, there was no science in what that man did. He was pushing an agenda. And 2, he falsified a lot of the data that he presented. So that study was actually retracted from the Lancet, and his medical license was revoked. So he is no longer a practicing medical doctor in the UK. But the damage that did is still felt even today. There are people in the UK, in other countries, who are, against, having their kids vaccinated, specifically with the MMR vaccine, because they feel, oh, my child is going to develop autism, when in actual fact, that was absolute fake science. It was absolute fake news. We can't even qualify it as science, but, no one, especially when you're not knowledgeable about science and how science works and, the full story of what happened, someone's going to read a headline and say, hey, the MMR, vaccine was linked to autism. I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated. And, that was a really damaging thing that was done by someone who was supposed to be a very trustworthy individual within the scientific and the medical community. So individuals who have done very unethical things, who have, conducted experiments which were not scientifically sound, which were not science at all, but pushed it as science, they have really kind of put us back in terms of, trying to get people a little less vaccine hesitant, trying to have less anti-vaxxers, opposing vaccines. And those are just some of the things, that then people who are very opportunistic on social media, especially, will cling on. That's where these, conspiracy theories will come from, that if you get this vaccine, this is what's going to happen to you. And this is what happened to, this person. Sometimes it's coming from very legitimate things that happened in the past, but those things were false. They were untrue. They were unscientific, and they were shown to be that. But when you're trying to push an agenda on social media and various platforms, you're not necessarily going to include all that information, are you? So that's just some of the context when it comes to where some of these conspiracy theories come from and how they inform vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaxxer sentiments, and also just the power of social media in proliferating those sentiments to an even wider audience.
Yeah. Because, as you were mentioning, I started to think, is there a correlation between one's educational level versus the views on vaccines? I don't know. Is that a case in terms of what you've seen? Or is that something that relates to, because sometimes you see, I was having a discussion with a friend just prior to having this episode and coming up with questions, and he was telling me that in his view, he thinks that the level of education one has, because, let's say there's outbreak, because, for example, in South Africa history, HIV was a big problem in this country, and there was still a level of misunderstanding exactly what HIV is. It's about, just wash yourself after you have sex or whatever the case is. And such information, the question therefore becomes, is it a case of one's education, or is it a case of just, again, maybe it's just the history again? What does education play a role in terms of how we view vaccines, just overall health?
So A lot of studies will show you that when we look at factors that are influencing certain things, let's say, perceptions, right? Yeah. So we sometimes run studies where we're trying to understand perceptions amongst, individuals in the population. And, there are studies that will say, the higher your level of education, the less vaccine hesitant that you're going to be. You're going to be a lot more trusting of the scientific community or the medical community, and a lot of your decisions are going to be informed, by that trust. But also some studies are going to pick up that, you could have a master's, a PhD, and you are still an anti-vaxxer, or you don't believe in vaccines, right? So it depends on the population that you're looking at. Perceptions differ from population to population. Sometimes, level of education is a significant contributor in terms of whether you're vaccine hesitant or anti-vaxxer, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's a combination of things, right? It's the same reason why, for example, you could have a master's degree, but you're not wearing your mask in public, right? You have the information available to you. You understand, or you've been told, why social distancing is a thing, why you need to be particularly hygienic and, sanitize your hands, wash your hands. But there are very many people with very high levels of education who are still not doing those things. So very often what we see in the social sciences and also in public health is how access to information, be that, the information that you are given by experts like me, or, authoritative bodies like WHO, or whatever the case may be, that access to information or your own level of education might not actually influence your behavior, right? So there's this disconnect, because we would think that, the more educated you are, we should see a reduction in vaccine hesitancy or anti-vax sentiments. But that's not always the case. So sometimes there are a number of other factors that are at play, right? What community you are in is also quite, pivotal in determining some of the perceptions that you might hold. And that is outside of the level of education that you might have. Your own personal experiences, right, might also inform that. So you might be a person, again, who has gone to university, or even has a secondary level of education where you can make sense of certain things, right? And make sense of the information that is given to you. But maybe you've had a particularly bad experience with, doctors and the public health system and the medical community. So already that has fostered the sense of distrust. So anything that those communities are going to tell you or advise you on, you're inherently going to be distrustful of it because of your personal experiences. So it really is a combination of factors outside of just your level of education that's going to inform what level of trust you're going to have in the scientific community, and also whether you're going to be vaccine hesitant or just outright anti-vaxxer. Yeah.
Sheesh. Now it makes me wonder now, because social media has it's played a significant role in terms of the pandemic, people's views.
Yeah.
And even in my own thoughts, I was thinking, back in the day, if you wanted information, you mostly had the library. You had to literally go to a library, look for a book on a particular topic to learn about something. Whereas today, you have literally your phone in your hand, and you can literally Google anything, and literally you can get, YouTube is even worse. You can just type something, and whatever has the most views or is the most catchy title, bam, and all of a sudden you're in this stream roll of videos telling you that there's depopulation going on, and you got to be worried about that. So what is your view on social media in terms of this current pandemic we're in? Is it helpful? In your view?
Yeah, it's quite the conversation. I think it could be a separate episode on its own. It could actually be a thesis, and people are writing, doing PhDs on the impact of social media, various aspects of social media on public health, right? But my goodness, where do I begin? Let me start off with the positives, right? It's a lot easier to address. I think social media, particularly for me as someone who is, social media savvy, I think I'm most prominent on Twitter, and I have, used that space to try and communicate the right information, right? And it's been very helpful. I've, had hundreds of people DMing me, asking, about whether it's safe for them specifically to get the vaccine, and just wanting some of their answers, some of their questions to be answered with regards to some of the uncertainties and their fears around the vaccine. And that's been tremendously useful, because they're the same people that I've sent a quick response to, that don't worry because of XYZ, and a week later, 2 weeks later, they've come back and said, hey, I got vaccinated. Thanks so much for giving me that information. So social media has really been great in terms of allowing experts to have direct access to the populations that they want to address, right? It's allowed, the head of the COVID committee in South Africa to be able to say things very directly to the South African population, right? It's allowed us to have an update on, what are the COVID cases looking like every day. Yeah, you can watch it on the news, but you can also access it via social media, right? So you'll just have to forgive me. My little dog is crying outside. Okay. So social media has really been a great tool in terms of making sure that people do have access to the right information, in as much as there's a lot of fake news, right, doing the rounds. It's been tremendously helpful for me, like I said, and I think it has contributed a lot of good, right? I think were it not for social media, maybe we might have had a lot more vaccine hesitancy. We might have had a lot more anti-vaxxer sentiments. I think it's an interesting question to ask. Maybe not a feasible experiment to run, but it begs the question, what would anti-vaxxer sentiments and vaccine hesitancy, how would that look like in the absence of social media, right? But in as much as it is allowed for a lot of good and the ability to, directly share resources and fact-checked accurate information, social media is also the space where fake news is traveling at 16 times the rate of legitimate, verified information. And that's very difficult to contend with, right? And, whatever tweet that I am sending out and saying, hey, this is why you should not be worried about, the COVID vaccine or vaccines in general, or whatever the case may be, there are 16 other tweets, that are doing the rounds at the same time, but at a faster rate, that are saying the exact opposite thing, right? And it's not just on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on Facebook. Facebook is just really, I would say, the home of anti-vaxxer sentiments and vaccine hesitancy. And I think they've been very poor in addressing that. WhatsApp is also, a big one. Not surprised, since, Facebook, WhatsApp, same owner. Yeah. But, WhatsApp is, now you've got all these chain videos and messages being sent, and it's very tough. I always say it's very difficult if I had to spend time addressing misinformation versus sending out information that I know is accurate, is true, has been, fact-checked, is, supported by other experts in the field, I simply would just not have enough hours in the days to dispel misinformation. And so it really has to be, a decision to say, on some days, I'm going to address misinformation because sometimes they're particularly harmful things that are doing the rounds at that particular moment in time that you have to address, because whatever message that you're going to try and send out subsequent to that is quite dependent on you debunking this myth. So sometimes I, will do a thread on debunking these myths on COVID or on vaccines, right? But a lot of my time and my efforts and my energy is reserved to making sure that I'm trying to put out correct information, because there's just simply too much information that is fake and that is illegitimate doing the rounds for me as an individual, certainly, to be able to adequately address. And so it really just becomes, that decision to say, let's rather try and push out as much information that we know to be correct and true as possible. Mm-hmm. And when we have time and when it is necessary and relevant, let's address the misinformation. So I suppose that's, the highlights of social media has been great in many instances. I've seen it for myself as well, but also the drawbacks of social media and just the speed at which information is shared across platforms. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges when you're an expert in any field, let alone a scientist who's trying to say something in the middle of a pandemic. Yeah,
that's very true. and part of the reason I was trying to avoid having questions, asking you things like, what is the vaccine? What does it do?
Yeah.
When I was coming up with questions, obviously talking with the friends about, the kind of questions we should ask Rufaro. And someone was asking, ask you about what the vaccine does. And I was like, I sent a link of your Twitter page. I'm like, go there.
Yeah.
And because I feel like sometimes you don't want to regurgitate something that's already there, and also empower people to also do proper due diligence and reading up on things. But I wanted to see what's your take on some of these aspects of, related to the vaccine, the pandemic. And some of the questions I had there was a question around, now South Africa is at a point where some people are getting vaccinated, some people are not. And obviously there's also the aspects of the mandate that's people are kind of worried about, and that's also being in place. Now the question therefore becomes, in the current context, there's the whole thing about herd immunity, and what exactly does that mean in terms of South Africa? What rate of people need to be vaccinated? And if not, what does that mean for the country?
Yeah. Geez, people love talking about herd immunity, but when you actually get down to what herd immunity is, then people are like, yeah, I'm not doing that. So herd immunity, or rather population immunity, right, is it's this concept that there is a disease, right? It could be any disease, and it takes a period of time, right, after people become infected with this disease. Some people are going to die, some people are going to get sick but recover, some people aren't going to become infected at all. But it's a point at which the disease no longer has the same impact as it had when it first entered the population. And basically, it's no longer running as rampant, right? And most of the population, or rather, let's say about 66 to about 70% of the population is now immune, right? So they're not going to be adversely affected by this disease. They're not going to become infected because they now have an immunity against this disease, right? The thing about herd immunity is that it can take years to develop, right? And that's something that people don't understand. They're like, yeah, no, let's not do the vaccine. Let's just, wait for herd immunity. That can take years, right? And by then, so many people have died. Not everyone who gets, infected with a particular pathogen and, that causes a specific disease is going to survive, right? Natural selection thing, not everyone's going to survive. Those who do survive are either going to fully recover, or they're going to have maybe, long-lasting effects, after they've been infected by the disease. And then you're going to have those that were not infected at all. So herd immunity is not the responsible way to go insofar as saying, let's just let COVID or any other disease for that matter, kind of just, run rampant and let's see how it goes, right? There are some diseases that we refer to as being self-limiting. So for example, when we have cholera outbreaks, right? Because of the way that cholera is, transmitted and all of those things, an outbreak doesn't necessarily become a pandemic because the pathogen itself is self-limiting. So at a certain time, it eventually just dies out. That's why we have so many recurrent cholera outbreaks. It starts, it flares, it dies out. Infectious diseases like COVID, right? Or like SARS, which is almost like the sister to COVID, aren't like that. So we can't just say, let's let it play out and see how things go. It's not self-limiting in that regard. So it's just going to keep infecting people and being transmitted from one person to the next, right? So then allowing the population to just kind of chill and see how things go is not the responsible way to go. And it's going to result in a lot more people dying and being adversely affected by COVID than is necessary. So the best way for the population to achieve herd immunity is that everyone gets vaccinated, right? Because the vaccine is, one, trying to prevent you from getting COVID, but should you get COVID, you're going to have less severe symptoms, right? And that's particularly important now that we've got so many variants going around, right? Each variant that comes up is a lot stronger. It's a lot more potent. You're going to have a higher viral load. You're going to have worse symptoms as a result. And your likelihood of recovering is also a little bit shaky just because it's a much stronger variant, right? And the more time that passes with people being unvaccinated, right, means that COVID has the opportunity to go from one person to the next. And as it's bouncing between people in a population, that's where these mutations or these changes happen. And that's how we have one variant after the next, after the next. We had an alpha variant. We then had a beta variant. We then had a delta variant, which is the majority of cases in South Africa currently. But, who said a couple of weeks ago that now we have the epsilon variant, which I think right now is a variant of interest. It's not necessarily a variant of concern in South Africa, but in other countries, they're already, struggling with other variants. And so the more time that people spend being unvaccinated, really, it is just giving the pathogen that causes COVID room to bounce around between people and become a lot stronger, a lot more resistant. And that's not a scenario that we want, right? So the best way for us to achieve 100% herd immunity is if 100% of the population, were vaccinated. That's not always possible, not necessarily because of vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaccine or anti-vaxxer sentiments, but sometimes logistically it is not possible to get 100% of a population vaccinated. But if we get about 2/3 or 66% of the population vaccinated, that's a great way for us to then be able to say, you know what, our population has reached herd immunity. And that's really one of the targets, right? To get at least 66% of the South African population vaccinated, so that one, we put an end to, the development of these stronger variants, but also two, we limit the ability of COVID in terms of it being able to travel in the population. And then eventually it will die out, right? Post-pandemic, post-COVID pandemic looks like, a couple of outbreaks maybe in the Free State, a couple of outbreaks maybe in the Eastern Cape, but things that we very much have under control. And, maybe after a couple of weeks, a month or so, we can say, oh, this province no longer has COVID, right? So that's what we're working towards. But right now, our only sort of means to getting there is getting people vaccinated. We don't have a definitive treatment for COVID-19. And so the vaccine really does become our best shot. And, anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitant people aside, if we can just get people who are willing to become vaccinated and they, form part of that 66%, then it becomes a secondary issue of, people who don't want to get vaccinated. And the primary goal is to just make sure that we've got about 66% vaccinated, right? That has been impeded by the fact of, like things like vaccine shortages and not having enough supply, not being able to produce our own, things like that. And I think currently, sometimes we'll reach our target in terms of the number of people we need to be vaccinating each day. And sometimes we won't. Sometimes this is, a very logistical thing where certain vaccine stations are not open during weekends. Why are we not vaccinating during the weekends? Or maybe they're not open past a certain time. Maybe we're understaffed. So it's a lot of things that are impeding our ability right now to be able to vaccinate the number of people we need to get to this target of, 66% of the population being vaccinated. But it's something that we constantly have to strive towards, because right now, in the absence of any other treatment or definitive cure for COVID-19, the vaccine really is our best shot. I think about the United States, where they've vaccinated over 184 million people. And it's crazy because our population is 52, 53 million people. And yet we're nowhere close to making sure that, at least 2/3 of our population has been vaccinated. But the short answer really to this question of herd immunity, we can't just let COVID kind of just happen on its own and see how it goes. There's just too much loss of life that would entail. And so it's really necessary for us to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And that is how we will have herd immunity. We have herd immunity in terms of measles, in terms of things like polio and all of those things, because people have been vaccinated. And it's exactly the same concept and the same process that's happening right now with COVID-19.
Yeah, as you're mentioning the whole herd immunity thing, I was thinking about vaccines, for example, when I was a child, like me and my brother got chickenpox. It was probably around 2000s. And, unfortunately, my brother passed away from it. And I still obviously have to face the marks on it to my face. But I was always thinking, because I ended up when I was a doubt, like, you know what, was there a chickenpox vaccine, you know? And I realized, I think South Africa was only introduced at a later stage. But I was actually thinking, you know what, it's kind of things that you have to kind of think about, and the importance of, you know, taking treatment as best as possible, being knowledgeable about the effects of certain medication. But as you said, you know, herd immunity is not necessarily the goal, but it's important to at least get as much people to be vaccinated, so at least we avoid new variants, you know, because I always think, you know, at some point it's going to get to the zombie apocalyptic point of view. Who knows? But I think for the sake of time, because obviously time is probably running short now, maybe my last question before I go to the quick hit questions is, next year, this time, where do you think the world will be?
That's a very good question. We're in October 2021. So where are we going to be in October 2022? I suppose maybe start off with where I would hope we would be, right? I hope that we would be very close to having, you know, the majority of our population vaccinated. I would hope that that would be the case as well in other countries. And I think, you know, in South Africa, in as much as, you know, we had little stumbling blocks with regards to shortages and trying to get vaccines delivered, and I think we're well past that. Now it's just saying we have all these vaccines, but, you know, we don't have the people to vaccinate. But in other countries, that's very different, right? Equitable access to vaccines is still quite a thing, right? And that also feeds into this whole thing of, you know, mandatory vaccinations and travel and vaccine passports. And you know, I said vaccine passports are not a new thing. You know, when you travel to, you know, West Africa and, you know, countries in North Africa as well, you're required to have a vaccination for yellow fever, you know, and if you don't have it, you're not entering the country. So mandatory vaccines are not a new thing. To go to school, you know, when you start grade 1, you need to have your vaccine card, your vaccine record. It's just a prerequisite. So it's nothing that is new, exclusive to COVID-19. But for me, if you're going to say that travel is dependent on mandatory vaccinations, or that, you know, people can only come to work or do certain things if they're vaccinated, then we also have to address the issue of access, right? Because if we don't have equitable access to vaccines, then that's when it becomes discriminatory, right? You can't say to someone, well, you need a vaccine, but at the same time, they don't have access to that vaccine, right? So my hope is that this time next year, most people in this country and other countries as well, especially the developing countries and the global south, as we're referred to, one, have access to the vaccine, and two, would have vaccinated, you know, the majority of their populations to reach this population immunity. I would hope that, you know, life would start returning to some kind of normal, but a normal that is very cognizant that, you know, whilst we might have life after COVID, we need to live life with the cognizance that this is not the last pandemic that we're going to go through. Things like climate change are definitely going to influence the pandemics we're going to be seeing in the future. And very many things, right? Things like poverty and all of that, the way that people are forced to live, those are all things that kind of exacerbate, you know, things like outbreaks and pandemics. And if we don't start addressing things like inequality, if we don't start paying attention to climate change and, you know, that how that affects, you know, things like microorganisms and stuff melting from the glaciers and all of that, then we're going to have another pandemic. That's a definite, right? And I always say that COVID has been an interesting mix of very highly infectious, but also not, you know, with a high mortality, like something like Ebola or dengue fever, right? But we're going to eventually, you know, hopefully not in our generation, but we're eventually going to have a pandemic that combines potency in terms of mortality and also infectiousness, as well as its mode of transmission. And then we're going to be in big trouble. So the way that we're living needs to change, right? The sanitizing, the social distancing, the wearing of masks, I think that's something that, you know, we should ideally take, even in, life after COVID, when people have flu, because you remember, thousands of people die from ordinary influenza each year. If we wore masks during, flu season, we would have a lot less, people getting sick, also a lot less people dying each year. If we sanitized and kept washing our hands, if we practiced social distancing, especially when we have things like flu or, whatever else, diseases are doing the rounds at that time and are, airborne, I think we would see an improvement in health outcomes. And I think we might just be able to buy ourselves enough time before the next pandemic. And the thing about pandemics is, you do a lot of this preparation, you have these centers that are monitoring and surveilling and trying to pick up, do we have more cases of this thing than we had last year? But sometimes when a pandemic hits, it hits, and, countries aren't as well prepared as they would like to. But I think ultimately, I would like for us to, to use this as a really big lesson, and then it sounds kind of, I don't know, weird saying that because a lot of people have died, right? But I think in the efforts to prevent a further loss of life, we can use it as a lesson on how we can go about leading more responsible lives, much healthier lives. And I'm not talking necessarily about healthy eating and all those things, but just like healthy practices and acknowledging that we don't live in isolation, we live in a community. And a pandemic is a result of how a community and a population lives, right? So that is my hope. Realistically, where I see ourselves being next year, I do, in a South African context, I do see us still struggling in terms of, hitting that population immunity, trying to get people vaccinated. I think we're going to have a number of challenges, specifically, in the Constitutional Court about these mandatory vaccinations and, vaccine passports and the like. I do see the pandemic, being used or continuing to be used as a political tool, which has been very unfortunate to witness, but it is what it is. But honestly, I do think that we are going to be in a much better place than we are at currently. I would hope that, in the space of a year, we would have managed to push those vaccinations. We would have upped campaigns and, access to the right information such that people would become a less, vaccine hesitant. And yeah, man, that we just have a lot less COVID cases than we have currently. We're not going to be seeing our emergency rooms and our hospitals, public and private sector, just filled to capacity. I hope that situation, it should have, I think, considerably been ameliorated in the space of a year. But yeah, it's very difficult to kind of say some of these things, because there are a lot of moving parts, and it's also dependent on how various stakeholders, interact and, the decisions that they make. But, those are my hopes and some of the things that I think are going to be happening a year from now. Yeah. But I guess, time will tell, and I guess we'll just also have to see what happens till then.
Sheesh. Cross fingers, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cross fingers. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that input, at least,
yeah,
there is a mix of, as you hope, and I think it's important things to also hope and look forward and just have that confidence that things should get better. But yeah, I really appreciate at least the context about, understanding the aspects of the pandemic, also just the continuation of things like wearing masks, even post the pandemic, and if should there be a cure, just practicing healthy living. But I think for the sake of time, let me just go through some quick, these are questions whereby it's not necessarily related to the topic. I just want to understand maybe how you manage some of these things. These are just casual, fun questions. So just off the top of your head, it's going to be quick questions. First question, pandemic life. What's your go-to movie or series?
Go-to, shucks. I watch a lot of documentaries. It can get a bit heavy, so I don't watch as many series or movies as I would like to, but I love Squid Game on Netflix. That was absolutely amazing. I'm probably not going to watch it again, but my go-to series has been Squid Game. Outside of that, I think I watched a lot of The Office, the US version. I absolutely love that. I think I've watched it like 3 times now.
Okay, perfect. Next one, best highlight of the pandemic so far in your life?
Highlight. What has been the highlight? having an excuse not to have to leave my house. Like when people are like, hey, you want to meet up? Sorry, it's a pandemic. So that's been really great. Not having to kind of, like validate why I don't want to go out. I just can say, yeah, it's a pandemic. I stayed home.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions regarding obviously the writing part in your journalism. But if there was one particular topic, and for which publication would you write for? What topic would you want to write about? If you could choose any publication.
Wow. Wow, you caught me off guard there. I think I would, one of my wish lists has been to write for the New York Times. I think they are a behemoth just in terms of editorial standard. And, I've read so much from the New York Times, some of my favorite writers, I've written for the New York Times. So it would definitely be the New York Times. And honestly, the honest answer would be whatever story had come to me in that moment, I would hope that I'd be able to pitch it to the New York Times and that it's a story that they would run with. Can't think of one right now because I've been pitching so many ideas to so many different publications. But whatever story I was really wanting to write at that time, I would hope that I would pitch to New York Times and that they would run with it. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Are you still writing right now though?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So outside of my 9 to 5, I'm still I'm writing for the Africa Report. I'm writing for New Frame. I'm also writing for Amaka, which is a London-based publication. So, yeah, I still write quite a bit, freelancing, of course. But yeah, I'm still writing quite a bit. So I'm still doing very much of the best of both worlds type thing. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then the last one, it's a pandemic question. Well,
okay.
Zombie apocalypse about to arise in 2 days. You have 1,000 rand only. The groceries or shops are still open. What is the 1,000 rand going to? And you can only use it you can only last for 1 week until let's say they get a cure.
The zombies are probably going to kill us. So I'd probably just go buy a pair of sneakers, to be honest. Joking. So what would I buy with 1,000 rand? I guess I'd buy, necessities. I'd buy feminine products. I'm gonna need those. I'm gonna buy sure guys.
Okay, let's remove necessities. Guilty pleasure.
Yes.
Let's say 5,000 rand.
Guilty pleasure.
Yeah. What's it? You got a few days to live also. What's your guilty pleasure gonna rush to?
So am I definitely gonna die?
Yeah, let's put it like that.
Okay, it's fine. I'd buy a bit of food, I guess, but I go buy shoes, drippers forever. So I'd buy shoes, post my snaps on the gram, and then call it a day.
Perfect. Cool. Rufaro, from my side, thank you again for availing yourself. I know Saturdays are quite hectic for some people. It's your personal time. But I thank you again. And I think from the other team from the podcast, really appreciate your time. This was really informative. I think these kind of conversations are important. Sometimes we try to shallow it, and sometimes podcasts simply based off humor and stuff and trying to have fun conversations to get clicks and all that. But I think just having informative discussions is key. So I thank you again for being part of the podcast today. Yeah, no, this has been really fun. Sometimes I have, mental illness is a thing, guys, but, I have a little bit of anxiety sometimes. Sometimes I'm like, oh, how is this podcast going to go? And I have so much anxiety. I always say like the anticipation of an event is sometimes so much more extreme than the event itself. But this was really fun. It was definitely not a waste of my time. It's been a great start to my day, actually. Thank you for hosting. I know you said you're usually behind the scenes, but I thought you were a brilliant host. It was a really fun, really engaging conversation. I loved the format. I hope we do it again. Perfect. I was actually hoping one of the other day, in the future, hopefully we can have more discussions around just overall diseases, viruses, and more so tap into more exactly what you do in your career. But most of the journalistic part was also tried a lot of questions about that, but maybe in the future. Yeah. But I really appreciate joining the podcast. I think I'll just let you know once the podcast is out. Obviously, I'm going to do some editing and all that. Don't forget to send me your pictures, so at least I can use that for the Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, all righty. Well, I have a question for you, but I will offline that. Should I send you an email? Should I Instagram you? Instagram, whichever.
Cozies. All righty. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Rufaro. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. We'll keep in touch.
Okay,
I'll let you know once the podcast is out.
Yes, please. That would be great.
Cool. Cheers. Enjoy your weekend.
Cozies. You too.
Cheers. Bye. Bye.